Welcome back to the Big.Chris.Big.Receding.Hairline channel. Now, I've been asking a lot of friends and family about video ideas, and one person suggested torture and execution techniques. Yeah. Now, at first, I thought to myself, wow, that is super creepy, and YouTube will probably ban this video. But after thinking about it for a while, I thought to myself, screw it. We're going to do this video. So we're going to be talking about something that is quite awkward. We often don't like talking about it. It's a little bit hush hush. Let's pretend it never happened. But in this video, we're going there. So we are going to be talking about the history of torture. Torture can be defined as the deliberate infliction of severe pain or suffering on a person for reasons such as punishment, extraction of a confession, interrogation for information, or the intimidation of a third party. Now, in ancient, medieval and modern times, torture was actually legal and morally right. It was accepted in the community. Now, archaeologists suggest that torture has been performed in the early Neolithical Europe, which was 7,000 years ago. Now, torture is commonly mentioned in historical sources about the Assyrians and the Achaemenid Persians, and it seems that throughout history, civilisations have used torture in two main reasons. Now, the first one is for judicial process, and then the second one is for punishment. Now, here is a really bizarre part about torture. Now, torture was seen as a reliable way to either elicit a truth from a suspect of crime. It was seen as a suitable punishment for people needing to be taught a lesson. And torture was also seen as an appropriate deterrent for people who might want to commit a future crime. But listen to this. In European countries, they actually had regulations on which torture methods could and couldn't be used. I know. So the most common form of torture in Europe was both the rack and the strappado. Now, looking into the regulations of these courts in Europe, it appears that all torture methods that could result in the death of the person were very rarely used. And in fact, it had to be an extreme case, such as treason. But between the years 1000 and 1200, torture, it wasn't used that much. But as Europe slips a little bit further into the 1200s to the 1500s, torture increases quite a lot. And in fact, during this time period, 1470s, this is where we actually see the Spanish Inquisition. Now, this has become world famous for persecution, torture, and punishment over religion. During the same period of time in Europe, the courts, they actually needed a high standard of proof when they were trying to convict criminals. So without eyewitnesses and DNA and modern forensic technology, proving a crime such as murder and theft and treason was very difficult. So the courts, they would authorise torture so that they could try and gain a confession. During the 17th century, the practice of torture remained legal throughout the European countries, but it wasn't used very much. And as we start to go between the 17 and 1800s, countries started to actively abolish torture. Now, we're not completely sure why this happens. There doesn't seem to be one direct answer for this. Maybe it's due to the Enlightenment and the ideas that come from that. Maybe it's because the courts throughout Europe need a lower standard when convicting criminals. Or it might be the simple fact that torturing people and putting people in excruciating pain violates human rights. Now, it might be a little bit of all of these, but what we do know is that from a legal point of view, throughout Europe, the practice of torture reduced dramatically. But we have to remember, just because torture isn't being used in the legal system anymore, doesn't mean that torture doesn't still exist. So an example of this comes from China, where the judicial system that had been using torture for 2 millennia, they actually banned it in China in 1905. So they actually banned, in particular, flogging and dismemberment. But unfortunately, the practice in China actually continued all the way through the 1900s. Now, torture was widely used by the colonial powers to subdue resistance throughout their colonies, and it actually reached its peak during the mid-1900s. And this is where many countries were seeking their independence from their colonizers. Now, it is estimated that around 300,000 people were tortured during the Algerian War of Independence when they were fighting against the French. But the French weren't the only people using torture. The British and the Portuguese also implemented torture techniques to try and keep their colonies in check. As we speak, I would love to be able to say to you that torture has vanished from the world, never to be seen again. But unfortunately, this is not the case, and modern day torture still exists. Unfortunately, it's usually under dictatorships, terrorist organisations, and poor countries where corruption is rife. So to finish this video, I'm now going to show you some of the most weird and terrifying torture methods throughout human history. Now, as we were talking about earlier, methods of torture can be used as a painful punishment or as a painful way to kill somebody. So we have to keep that in mind when I now show you these terrifying torture methods. I'm going to leave it up to you. Do you think somebody would survive this method, or do you think it would kill them? The ancient Greeks created keel hauling. This was where a victim would have rope tied around their waist and they would be dragged under the bow of a ship. Now, the punishment for this was through drowning and having the barnacles which grow on the bottom of the ship. They would create deep lacerations throughout the body. Now, the ancient Greeks also created this terrifying thing, which is known as the Brazen Bull. This was a bull made out of bronze, and it had a little hatch on the side. The victim would be thrown into the belly of the Brazen Bull, and then a fire would be started under its belly. It would create a similar experience as to being thrown into a modern day oven. Truly terrifying. The ancient Romans created a method known as the penalty of the sack. So the victim would be placed into a large leather sack with several wild animals. Then the sack would be tied up and thrown into a river. And as the victims and the animals all frantically tried to escape the sack, they would claw and bite into each other, often resulting in the death of the victim. The Romans also created being burnt alive. So the victim would be tied to a stake, a fire would be set around them, and they would be burnt to death. The Romans also created the Judas Cradle. This would be where the victim would be lowered onto a sharp object. The sharp object would then enter between the legs, usually in the piece of fleshy skin or in the anus. The spike would then usually go into the midriff, often resulting in an excruciating death. Over in China, we have a method known as Ling Chi. Now, this is basically amputation. So the victim would first start having their fingers and toes amputated as a punishment. Then, depending on if the punishment was extreme, they might have their arms and legs amputated. If we go down to Southeast Asia, we have a torture method known as elephant trampling. And I don't really need to explain that. That is an elephant standing on the victim. Pretty awful stuff. As we then shoot over to Europe, we have their most popular torture method, the rack. So the victim would be laid on a piece of board and their arms and their feet would be tied to cranks. And as the cranks turned, it means that the arms would be stretched, the legs would be stretched, and the victim would have dislocated shoulders, hips and knees. Now, specifically looking at France, we have a method known as the choke pear. Now, a mechanised metal screw would be placed in the victim's mouth. Then the screw would be turned and the piece would get bigger and bigger, thus resulting in the dislocation of the jaw. Now, over in Britain, we also have a torture method known as rat torture. So a rat would be placed into a bucket and then placed onto the torso of the victim. Then a fire or a heat source would be then given to the bucket, which means that the bucket would get red hot and the rat inside would then frantically try to escape the bucket. Now, the claws and the teeth can't bite through metal. So what do? They bite into the flesh and they try to escape the bucket through the human body. Pretty awful stuff, once again. Now, over in a place known as Wallachia, which is Bulgaria in medieval times, we have what is known as impalement. It's one of the most famous out there. There was a guy known as Vlad the Impaler, and he got that because he impaled people. He would get victims, he would get wooden stakes, and he would impale people. It was very similar to the Judas Cradle, where a large sharp object would be thrusted up through the human body. But the difference between the Judas Cradle and impalement was that impalement went in through the bottom but came out of the top. So it was a full impalement. To me, that's actually probably the worst out of everything on this list. So there we are, everybody. That is the history of torture. Now, if you like this type of video, please give it a like and a subscribe. And also check out some of my videos on the Big.Chris.Big.Receding.Hairline channel. And hopefully you enjoy the content and you like to come back to the channel. And once again, have an amazing day.